A fiery TV host thought she had Clint Eastwood trapped, mocking his faith, his legacy, his values, but in true Eastwood style, he didn't flinch. Instead, with just a few powerful words, he turned the entire interview upside down, leaving her speechless and the audience stunned. What did he say that changed everything? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio of The Unfiltered Truth with Madison Steel pulsed with electric anticipation. The stage lights glowed an icy blue, casting a crisp reflection off the polished glass table at the center. Rows of audience members shifted eagerly in their seats, eyes locked on the empty chair across from the host. Tonight wasn't just another episode. Tonight was an event. The kind that would dominate the news cycle, flood social media, and solidify Madison Steel's reputation as the queen of takedowns. The kind that would make headlines before the interview even ended. The cameras zoomed in, production staff whispered final adjustments into their headsets, and the producers hovered by their monitors, fingers poised, ready to clip any moment that could be spun into a viral sensation. Madison sat with the calculated ease of someone who had mastered the art of media warfare. At just 32, she had clawed her way to the top of the cutthroat world of political commentary, building her empire on sharp wit, relentless interrogation, and an ability to dismantle conservative figures on live television. It wasn't just about asking tough questions, it was about winning. And tonight, she had a golden opportunity. Clint Eastwood, a living legend, a relic of a bygone era, the man who had defined Hollywood masculinity for generations. At 94 years old, he wasn't just an actor, a director, or a cultural icon. He was a symbol. And in Madison's world, symbols were meant to be challenged, dissected, and, if possible, dismantled. Eastwood represented the old guard. Traditional values, faith, masculinity, and a steadfast belief in individualism. To Madison, he was the perfect target. She had done her homework. Every controversial quote, every conservative stance he had ever taken, every moment the media had deemed problematic, it was all loaded and ready. She had studied his past interviews, watched his decades-old films, and even prepared preloaded clips of statements she knew she could spin against him. She could already picture the reaction. An aging, out-of-touch cowboy caught off guard by a sharp, modern journalist. It was a guaranteed win. And then the doors opened. A hush fell over the crowd like the breath before a storm. There was no dramatic entrance, no showmanship. Just Clint Eastwood walking in, slow and steady, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. He didn't need an introduction. He didn't need theatrics. His presence alone was enough. The weight of history moved with him, the kind that didn't need to be announced, only acknowledged. He took his seat across from Madison, lowering himself into the chair with the same quiet confidence that had made him an icon for over half a century. He didn't glance at the cameras. He didn't scan the crowd. He simply settled in, folding his hands in his lap, and waited. Madison took a slow breath, steadying herself. She was good at this, better than most. But there was something about the way he sat there, completely unbothered, that threw off her usual rhythm. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't playing into the energy of the room. He was just there, like a mountain that had seen too many storms to be impressed by a little rain. And then she saw it. A small silver cross necklace, barely visible beneath the collar of his shirt. Her pulse quickened. This was it. She had expected a good interview, maybe even a tense exchange, but now she had something better. Religion, faith, tradition, the kind of topics that, when handled correctly, could turn into viral gold. The wheels in her head spun at lightning speed, formulating the perfect approach. She could already imagine the headlines. Clint Eastwood exposed, Hollywood legend clings to outdated beliefs, intense interview with Madison Steel. She adjusted her posture, tilting her head just slightly, letting a slow, knowing smile creep onto her lips. Oh, this was going to be easier than she thought. Madison Steel exhaled slowly, letting her smirk settle as she leaned forward, the dim glow of the studio lights casting a sharp gleam across her perfectly manicured nails. She had mastered the art of the moment. The pause, the tension, the slow build before the takedown. She didn't rush. She didn't lunge. No, she savored these moments, letting them breathe, stretching the silence just long enough to make the audience lean in. That was the trick. That was how you turned a simple interview into an event. Her eyes flicked once more to the small silver cross resting against Clint Eastwood's collar. Oh, this was a gift. It was the kind of thing that didn't need much work. She wouldn't have to dig into policy stances, wouldn't have to bring up old interviews. No, this was something simpler, more instinctual. It wasn't just about religion. It was about perception. A Hollywood legend, the face of gritty, unapologetic masculinity, sitting in front of millions with a cross hanging from his neck. She could spin it so easily. Faith, tradition, outdated values. Things the media loved to frame as relics of a time long gone. She glanced at the crowd, catching a few eyes twinkling with anticipation. They were waiting for the first jab, the first little cut. She gave it to them. "Clint," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "I have to ask, what's with the cross?" The room hushed, the audience hanging on the words, waiting. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to make it look casual, just enough to make it seem like a passing observation rather than the baited trap it was. Clint didn't react immediately. He sat there, still, unmoving, the weight of his presence pressing into the moment. His fingers remained laced together on the table, his expression unreadable. He didn't shift. And then, ever so slightly, he smiled. Not a broad grin, not the kind of chuckle a flustered guest might offer to buy time, but something deeper, something knowing. It was the kind of smile a man gave when he'd already seen the whole game play out before the first move was made. Madison's stomach tightened. The audience let out a smattering of nervous laughter. A few chuckled outright, thinking it was part of the show. Others shifted in their seats, sensing something different, something they couldn't quite put their finger on yet. Still, Madison pushed forward. "Didn't peg you for the jewelry type," she added, her voice carrying that familiar honeyed condescension, the same tone she had used on countless guests before him, the one that said, "I'm leading this dance, and you don't even know it yet." Clint's smile didn't waver. His eyes, sharp as ever, locked onto hers. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the question sit there, untouched, unclaimed. The silence was suffocating, stretching long enough for the laughter in the crowd to die down into a palpable stillness. And then, in that unmistakable gruff voice, low and steady, he finally answered. "You think it's funny?" The question wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational, but it hit like a hammer. Madison let out a small chuckle, more of a reflex than a genuine response, but there was something in the way Clint was looking at her that made her sit just a little straighter in her chair. "No," she said, tilting her head again, playing off the moment like it was all in good fun. "I just think it's unexpected, that's all." Still, Clint didn't move, didn't flinch. Madison had been in this position before, when guests stiffened under pressure, when they squirmed in their seats, when they stammered to defend themselves. That was when she knew she had them. But Clint? He wasn't stiff. He wasn't squirming. He was waiting. And suddenly she realized she had made a mistake. She had assumed he would react the way the others had, that he would smirk, shake his head, brush off the comment and let her push further. Instead, he had flipped the weight of the moment onto her without even trying. The audience felt it too. The dynamic was shifting, the energy tilting ever so slightly in the opposite direction. She couldn't let that happen. She had to regain control. So she went for the next strike. "Come on, Clint," she said, her tone light, feigning curiosity, pretending the moment wasn't slipping through her fingers. "You built an entire career playing the tough guy, the cowboy, the no-nonsense enforcer. the man who doesn't take orders from anyone, and yet, here you are, wearing a cross like some choir boy. Laughter rippled through the audience, louder this time. It was exactly the reaction she wanted. The cameras panned for reaction shots, the producers at the back of the studio exchanging quick nods. This was the clip that would go viral, the moment that would be clipped, packaged, and sent rocketing across social media. She leaned back in her chair, triumphant. And then Clint Eastwood spoke. You wouldn't have mocked it if it was any other symbol. The laughter stopped. It didn't fade. It didn't soften. It stopped. A few people in the audience inhaled sharply, shifting in their seats. The tension in the room became something different, something heavy, something real. Madison felt her chest tighten, but she pushed forward, refusing to let him take control. Look, I respect Faith, I do, she said, softening her voice slightly, feigning reason. I just think we've moved past needing things like that. Clint tilted his head, watching her, calculating. Then, with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding exactly how to control a room, he asked the question that would end the debate before it had even truly begun. Tell me something, sweetheart. His voice was slow, deliberate. What do you believe in? Madison froze. For just a second, a fraction of a second. But Clint saw it, and so did the audience. And before she could recover, before she could summon some polished, rehearsed response, Clint delivered the final blow. Because if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. The silence after that wasn't just still. It was deafening. Madison Steel had walked into this interview thinking she was the one leading the charge. She didn't realize Clint Eastwood had already won. For the first time in her career, Madison Steel had nothing to say. The silence was thick, the kind that didn't just fill the room, it took hold of it, swallowed it whole. Every camera, every eye in the studio was locked onto her, waiting, watching. A moment ago, she had been in control. She had the audience, the momentum, the confidence. But now? Now she was stranded in a moment she never expected, a moment she had no plan for. Clint Eastwood sat there, calm as ever. He wasn't smug. He wasn't gloating. He had delivered his words with the weight of a man who had seen lifetimes more than the person sitting across from him, and he didn't need to explain them. Because if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Madison's smirk was gone. She had been trained for this, had built her career on quick recoveries, on flipping a moment back in her favor, on making her guests stumble and scramble for the right words. But Clint? Clint didn't stumble. He didn't scramble. He didn't even shift in his seat. He had turned the moment into something more than an interview, more than a debate. He had turned it into a reckoning. The audience could feel it. The entire studio had changed. The energy that had once fed off Madison's sharp-edged style, her signature brand of arrogance and mockery, was no longer there. The very people who had chuckled at her jabs minutes before were now looking at her differently. Madison forced a chuckle, trying to cut through the tension, but the sound felt out of place, unnatural. She reached for her water glass, buying herself a second to gather her thoughts, but her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it. She could feel it now. The shift. The power had slipped from her grasp, and she didn't know how to get it back. She needed to redirect. She needed to take control. Well, she said, clearing her throat, her voice an octave lighter than before. That's certainly a strong perspective. Clint didn't reply. He simply watched her, letting the moment stretch further, making it unbearable. She was used to controlling the pace, to leading the conversation where she wanted it to go. But now, she was the one being led. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. Madison exhaled, forcing herself back into form. Look, she said, her voice taking on a carefully controlled, measured tone. I don't have anything against Faith, Clint. Really, I don't. I just think the world has changed. We've evolved past needing to hold on to things like that. She gestured vaguely toward the cross, trying to dismiss it, to turn it back into a relic, an old habit that had outstayed its welcome. She needed the audience back on her side. She needed to remind them why they had come here in the first place, to watch her win. But Clint Eastwood didn't flinch. Instead, he reached down, his fingers brushing against the small silver cross resting against his chest. He didn't lift it, didn't hold it up for display. He simply touched it, the gesture small but powerful. "Who told you that?" he asked. Madison blinked. For the first time since the interview had started, she looked caught off guard. Clint tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Who told you we've evolved past needing things like faith, past believing in something bigger than ourselves?" His voice was calm, steady, like he was asking a question he already knew the answer to. Madison opened her mouth, but no words came out, because she didn't have an answer, not one that mattered. Clint leaned back slightly, his fingers still brushing against the worn silver cross. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice lowering just enough to make the entire studio lean in. "I've lived long enough to see this world change more times than I can count. I've watched people tear things down in the name of progress, only to realize too late that they never built anything to replace what they destroyed." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Madison's heart pounded in her chest. This was not how this was supposed to go. Clint continued, "You say we've moved past needing faith, moved past needing something to believe in, but I'll tell you what I've seen. The moment people stop believing in something bigger than themselves, they start believing in anything." He let the words settle. "They believe whatever they're told. They follow whoever shouts the loudest. They let people like you," he nodded toward her, not in anger, not in condemnation, but in truth, "tell them what matters, what's right, what's worth holding on to. And they don't even stop to ask why." The room was utterly still. Madison's hands curled into fists under the desk. This was not how this was supposed to go. She was supposed to be in control. She was supposed to be the one setting the pace, steering the conversation. But now, it wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a lesson. And she was the student. She needed to end this. She needed to find her out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Clint Eastwood had already won. And now, the whole world was watching it happen. The silence was deafening, stretching longer than any Madison had ever experienced on live television. The crew behind the cameras, trained professionals who had spent years capturing viral moments, crafting narratives, stood frozen, waiting. The control room was still, the producers staring at their screens, unsure whether to cut to commercial, unsure whether they should cut to commercial. Because this moment was bigger than the show. It was bigger than Madison Steel, bigger than Clint Eastwood. It was about something else entirely, something real, something that couldn't be spun or twisted. And for the first time in her career, Madison Steel had no idea what to do. She swallowed hard, willing herself to recover, but she knew, everyone in the room knew, it was already too late. The audience wasn't here for a takedown anymore. They were here for the truth. And tonight, Clint Eastwood had given it to them, without raising his voice, without arguing, without breaking a sweat, because some men don't need to win a fight. Some men are the fight. And Madison Steel had just stepped into one she was never prepared to face. For the first time in her career, Madison Steel had lost control of an interview. It was a rare, almost impossible moment, one that had never happened before. But here it was, unraveling before her, live in front of millions. The cameras captured everything, the shift in her posture, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the way her fingers tapped restlessly against the desk as she fought to regain her footing. Clint Eastwood, on the other hand, hadn't moved, not once. He sat there like a mountain, unshaken, unwavering, completely in command of the moment without even trying. His words still hung in the air, thick with weight, unchallenged and undeniable. "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything." The audience felt it, the shift, the truth. The undeniable presence of a man who had outlasted generations of critics, challengers, and skeptics, and who, even at 94 years old, still held the kind of power that no television host could dismantle. Madison had underestimated him. She had walked into this interview thinking she was about to make history, thinking she was about to do what no one else had done, reduce Clint Eastwood to nothing more than an outdated relic of Hollywood's past. Instead, she was the one sinking, and everyone could see it. She had one chance left, one final move to reclaim her control before it was too late, and she had to act now. With a breath, she straightened her back, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I have to say, Clint," she began, her voice steady but lacking the sharp confidence she had just minutes ago, "I didn't expect to get a sermon from you tonight." The audience chuckled. Softly, uneasily. It was a desperate attempt to lighten the moment, to regain the energy she had lost. But Clint didn't play along. He simply watched her. Madison pushed forward. "I mean, we get it. You're old school. You believe in tradition, in values that, let's be honest, don't exactly fit in today's world. That's fine, but let me ask you something." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Where does it end?" Clint raised a brow. Madison took that as permission to continue. This belief that things were better before, that we should hold on to old ideas, old traditions, old faiths. Where does it end? Because let's be real, Clint, the world has moved on. We don't live in the same America you grew up in. Things change, people change, and maybe, she gestured to his necklace, maybe clinging to something like that doesn't make you strong. Maybe it just makes you afraid. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. A shift, a calculated strike. Clint Eastwood didn't react, but something in the air did. For a moment, it felt as if the entire world had slowed, paused at the edge of something massive. The audience, the crew, the producers in the control room. They were all holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Clint leaned forward. Not much, just enough for Madison Steel to feel it, to feel the weight of his presence, pressing down on the moment, reclaiming it, reshaping it. "I've seen Afraid," he said, his voice low and gravelly, his eyes locked onto hers. "And sweetheart, that ain't it." The room went silent. Clint lifted his hand, thumb brushing against the small silver cross at his chest. "Afraid is when you stand for nothing, when you change your beliefs every time the world tells you to, when you let other people decide who you are and what you believe in." He paused, let it sink in. "Afraid," he continued, voice even softer now, "is when you spend your life tearing down people who know exactly who they are, because deep down, you don't." Madison Steele's smile faltered. This was different. This wasn't a guest who was flustered or defensive. This wasn't someone scrambling for a way out. Clint Eastwood was standing in the middle of the storm, letting the wind howl around him, and he hadn't budged an inch. Madison felt the pressure of the cameras, the weight of the audience's gaze. She could feel the sweat forming at the back of her neck. She needed to turn this around. Now. "So, what?" she said, forcing a small, tight laugh. "You think you have all the answers?" Clint shook his head. "Nope." She blinked. That wasn't the response she expected. Clint sighed, sitting back in his chair. "I don't have all the answers, kid. Never did. But I know one thing." His fingers curled around the cross. "I know that a man who stands for something, who holds on to what he believes in, no matter who laughs at him, will always be stronger than the one who tears it all down." The audience was completely still now. The energy in the studio had changed. Madison Steel was scrambling. And Clint Eastwood? Clint Eastwood had just turned her entire show into something she never intended it to be. A lesson, a moment of truth, an exposure, not of Clint, but of her. The camera zoomed in slightly, catching every flicker of emotion on Madison's face. She was trying to recover, trying to hide the fact that she had been knocked off course, but the audience saw it. And more importantly, so did Clint. He didn't need to say anything else. He had already said enough. The room sat in silence, the weight of his words hung in the air, heavy, immovable. Madison glanced toward the control room where the producers were staring at their screens, their faces blank. They knew, just as she did, that they had lost control of this segment. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. And as the seconds ticked by, stretching longer and longer, it became clear to everyone watching. Clint Eastwood had already won. Not because he had argued. Not because he had shouted or forced his opinion. But because he hadn't needed to. He had spoken the truth. And no one, not even Madison Steel, could argue with that. The interview wasn't over. But in every way that mattered, it was. The silence in the studio stretched on, thick and suffocating. It wasn't the usual pause that followed a particularly sharp exchange on the unfiltered truth with Madison Steel. It was something heavier, something final. The audience, which had been primed for an explosive takedown of Clint Eastwood, was now caught in an entirely different spectacle. They had expected to witness another conservative icon fumble under the weight of Madison's precision, her relentless questioning, her razor-sharp wit. But what they got instead was a masterclass in composure. Clint Eastwood had done something that no guest before him had managed to do. He had turned the mirror around. Madison Steel, the undisputed queen of the viral moment, the woman who had built her career dismantling others, now sat across from him, struggling to find her next move. It wasn't supposed to go like this. She had been in control. She had dictated the rhythm of this conversation, just like she always did. And yet, here she was, feeling the weight of her own tactics crushing down on her. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't playing her game. He never had been. And now, she had only one option left: fight to regain control, or risk letting this moment define her forever. She forced a tight-lipped smile, the kind that was meant to say, "I'm still in charge," but it lacked the sharpness it had just minutes ago. "Look, Clint," she started, her voice carefully measured. "I understand that faith means something to you. I respect that, I really do." Liar. The audience could hear it. They could feel the shift in her tone, the careful way she was trying to navigate herself out of this mess. But Clint just watched her. She continued, attempting to regain some footing. "But what I'm saying is, America isn't what it used to be. People don't think the way they did when you started in Hollywood. We've moved forward." A small, knowing smirk flickered at the corners of Clint's lips. He leaned back in his chair, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that made it clear he wasn't pressed by anything she was saying. "And what exactly," he asked, voice steady as stone, "have we moved forward to?" The audience leaned in. Madison hesitated. "I mean," she faltered for a second, then quickly recovered. "We live in a more accepting society now. People aren't tied down by outdated ideas. They're free to believe or not believe whatever they want." Clint nodded once, almost as if he agreed, but then he turned the conversation on its head. "You say people are free," he said, his voice still carrying that low, gravelly certainty. "But the second a man like me walks in here, wearing something that means something to him, you mock him for it." Madison opened her mouth to protest. "But that's not what I—" Clint raised a hand, stopping her before she could finish. "You want to talk about moving forward?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "You're sitting here telling me that the world has changed, that my beliefs are outdated, but what I see is a generation of people who tear down everything that came before them just so they don't have to live up to it." The air in the studio shifted. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of something much larger. The audience felt it, the truth of it. Because, whether they wanted to admit it or not, Clint had a point. How many times had people like Madison Steel, people in her world, dismissed anything that didn't fit their version of progress? How many times had they rewritten history to make themselves feel better about their own failures? And now, here she was, being confronted with it, live on her own show. She let out a short, breathy laugh, trying to shake off the tension. "Come on, Clint," she said, her voice dipping back into that condescending tone she used so often. "That's a little dramatic, don't you think?" Clint tilted his head slightly. "Is it?" Another beat of silence. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. She was losing them. Her producers knew it, she knew it. And the worst part? There was nothing she could do about it. Clint Eastwood had just pulled the floor out from under her, and now all she could do was scramble to find her balance before the fall was too far to recover from. She had to change the direction of the conversation. Quickly, Madison exhaled, forcing her body to relax, her fingers smoothing out the papers on the desk in front of her. "All right, Clint," she said, feigning amusement. "Let's put faith aside for a second. Let's talk about something else." Clint smiled, slow and knowing. "You want to move past it?" he asked. "Because you lost?" Madison's expression froze. The audience gasped. The control room erupted in chaos. The producers were scrambling, yelling over the headset, desperate to find a way to cut to commercial, to fix this before it went completely off the rails. But it was too late. Madison Steel had just lost everything. Clint Eastwood, with nothing but his presence, his patience, and a quiet, unwavering conviction, had just exposed her for what she was. A fraud. A woman who didn't actually believe in open discussion. A host who wasn't interested in a real conversation, only in winning. And now that she had lost, she wanted to move on. The audience knew it. The internet would know it within minutes. And Madison Steel knew it too. For the first time in her career, she had walked into a fight she couldn't win. And Clint Eastwood? Clint Eastwood had never been fighting in the first place. He had already won. For the first time in her career, Madison Steel sat frozen in her seat. The woman who had built an empire out of her ability to control, to manipulate, to dismantle even the strongest opponents with her sharp tongue and media-honed precision, had nothing. The silence in the Unfiltered Truth studio was no longer one of expectation, but of reckoning. Madison's usual arsenal of tactics had failed her. She had tried condescension. She had tried mockery. She had even tried to regain control by shifting topics. But Clint Eastwood, with nothing more than quiet certainty and a presence that commanded every inch of the space, had seen right through her. And so had the audience. The smirks were gone. The anticipation of watching another conservative figure collapse under her questioning had evaporated. In its place, an uncomfortable truth had settled in. Madison Steel was outmatched. But Madison was a professional, and professionals did not accept defeat. She inhaled sharply, forcing a tight smile. "Clint, I think we can both agree." He cut her off before she could even begin her next attempt at reframing the conversation. "I don't agree with much of what you're saying, sweetheart," he said, his tone still smooth, still steady. "And I don't think you do either." The audience inhaled collectively. Madison blinked, and for the first time in her career, a flicker of something unguarded flashed across her face. Doubt. He had her, and he knew it. The show was live, the cameras were rolling, the producers were scrambling in the background, but it no longer mattered. The narrative had slipped from Madison's grasp, and Clint Eastwood was in no hurry to give it back. The problem wasn't just that she had underestimated him. It was that she had overestimated herself. She had expected Clint to crumble under the pressure, to fumble his words, to get frustrated and give her the moment she needed to create a viral headline. Instead, he had remained perfectly composed, unshaken, and entirely disinterested in playing her game. And now, the audience had caught on. They weren't leaning forward, waiting for Madison to land the next blow. They were leaning toward him, listening to every word, every breath, as if waiting for the next lesson to unfold. She had walked into this interview thinking she was the one setting the trap, but Clint Eastwood had just closed it. Her fingers twitched slightly on the desk, the only visible sign that the weight of the moment was pressing down on her. But she had one last move, one final attempt at salvaging the disaster unfolding in real time. Madison let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head as if she were the one amused by this entire exchange. "All right, Clint," she said, her voice shifting into something lighter, something more conversational. "I'll bite. Since you seem so sure of yourself, tell me, what exactly do you think I believe?" It was a last-ditch effort, a final grasp for control. But Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let her escape. He tilted his head ever so slightly, studying her, measuring her. "I think," he said, voice unwavering, "that you believe in whatever makes you look good in the moment." The audience gasped. Madison's expression flickered, just for a split second, but Clint caught it. He leaned forward just slightly, lowering his voice so that every word sank deep into the stunned silence that had fallen over the studio. "You talk about progress, about moving forward," he said, "but what you really mean is control. Control over what people can say, what they can believe, and who they're allowed to respect." Madison swallowed. Clint didn't stop. "You sit here and mock a man for wearing a cross, not because you care about what it means, but because you thought it would make you look good to laugh at it. You don't stand for anything, Madison." His voice was calm, steady. "And that's why you just lost." Another silence. But this one was different. This was the silence of realization. The audience, the producers, the entire studio had just witnessed something they had never seen before. Madison Steel had been completely, utterly dismantled. Not by anger, not by aggression, but by the unshakable presence of a man who had nothing to prove. Clint Eastwood sat back in his chair, relaxed as ever, and let the weight of his words settle into the cracks that had just formed in Madison's carefully constructed world. She sat there, her mind racing, her producers panicking behind the scenes, trying desperately to find an escape route for her. But there was no way out. The damage had been done. And outside that studio, the internet was already watching. Within minutes, this moment would spread like wildfire. And Madison Steel, for the first time in her career, was about to learn what it felt like to be on the losing end of a viral moment. The moment the interview ended, the studio erupted into chaos. The control room buzzed with frantic voices, producers shouting over one another, trying to figure out how to contain the disaster that had just unfolded on live television. But it was already too late. The damage was done. Madison Steel sat motionless in her chair, her knuckles white against the sleek glass desk. The closing credits rolled, but she didn't hear them. The sound of the audience's stunned silence, the weight of Clint Eastwood's final words, they were still ringing in her ears. Her earpiece crackled. "Madison, we need to spin this. We need a statement, now." She didn't answer, because she knew there was no saving this. Across the country, across the world, the internet was already in motion. It had started before the interview had even ended. The moment Clint Eastwood had spoken those final, cutting words, "And that's why you just lost," the clip had been uploaded, retweeted, shared, dissected. Millions of people, many of whom had never even tuned in to the unfiltered truth before, were now watching one of the most stunning reversals in modern media history. Madison Steel, the queen of viral takedowns, the woman who had built a career on humiliating her guests, was now the one being taken apart. The headlines hit first. Clint Eastwood schools Madison Steel, a masterclass in composure. Hollywood legend exposes media bias in real time. Madison Steel's worst nightmare. A guest who wouldn't play her game. Then came the memes. Screenshots of Madison's stunned expression flooded social media. Someone looped Clint's line, "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything." Over-dramatic music, turning it into an instant viral soundbite. Faith matters. Respect the legend. Eastwood wins. The hashtags trended within minutes. And then the backlash truly began. Madison's usual supporters, the same people who cheered when she tore apart conservative figures, were eerily quiet. Some tried to defend her, saying Clint Eastwood had been unfair, that he had dismissed her arguments. But it wasn't working. Because even they knew there was nothing to defend. She hadn't debated him, she hadn't challenged him, she had mocked him. And he had dismantled her without raising his voice. In the hours that followed, her network scrambled. PR teams drafted rushed statements, trying to paint the interview as a spirited debate that had been misinterpreted. But the internet wasn't buying it. Even the media, which had once championed Madison as the rising star of progressive journalism, was beginning to distance itself. And then came the final blow. The network pulled the interview from their website. They had hoped that by scrubbing it, by pretending it didn't happen, they could slow the firestorm. But instead, it only made things worse. Because now, the internet smelled blood. People re-uploaded the clip, making sure it would never be buried. The more the network tried to erase it, the more viral it became. By the time Madison Steel finally looked at her phone, the notification count was in the hundreds of thousands. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't trending for a victory. She was trending because she had lost. And she had lost badly. Madison Steel sat alone in her dimly lit dressing room, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the relentless flood of notifications on her phone. It wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. Every major media outlet, every political commentator, every social media influencer had latched on to the disaster that had just unfolded on The Unfiltered Truth. Her career-defining moment, the one that was supposed to catapult her into media legend, had turned into an inescapable nightmare. She had underestimated Clint Eastwood. She had assumed, like so many before her, that he was just another aging conservative relic to be dissected and humiliated for entertainment. But instead, he had destroyed her. Effortlessly. Her network executives were in full crisis mode, their carefully curated public narrative slipping through their fingers like sand. They had seen their stars take hits before, but never like this. Never this publicly, never this permanently. A knock on her door. She didn't move. A pause, then the voice of her producer, low and tight with tension. "Madison Corporate wants to see you." She already knew what that meant. 1,000 miles away, Clint Eastwood sat at a quiet cafe in Carmel, California, his favorite spot along the coast where the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He sipped his black coffee, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he listened to the distant hum of the waves. The news had reached him, of course. His team had sent him the links, the headlines, the viral clips that now lived on every corner of the internet. But Clint wasn't the type to gloat. He didn't need to. He had done exactly what he always did, let his actions speak louder than his words. A young journalist hesitated nearby, nervously clutching a notepad, eyes flicking between her phone and the living legend sitting just a few feet away. She finally found the courage to approach. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, clearing her throat, "do you have any comment on the reaction to your interview?" Clint didn't look up immediately. He simply took another sip of coffee, setting the cup down with deliberate ease before glancing at her. A slow, knowing smirk. Then, in that signature gravelly voice, he gave the only response he ever needed. "Nope." And just like that, the conversation was over. Because real legends don't need to explain themselves. They don't need to chase validation. They stand firm, rooted in who they are. And the world listens. Clint Eastwood didn't just win an interview that night. He reminded the world why true strength never fades. He didn't need to argue, didn't need to raise his voice, and certainly didn't need to play by the rules of modern media takedowns. He simply stood firm in his values, in who he was, and let the weight of truth do the talking. Madison Steel thought she had him cornered, ready for another viral takedown, another scalp to add to her growing career. But what she didn't realize was that she wasn't just up against an actor. She was up against a legend, a man who had spent his life carving his own path, standing by his convictions, and refusing to conform to the fleeting expectations of a world obsessed with trends and political correctness. And that's the lesson modern society so often forgets. In today's world, people are pressured to fit in, to bend their beliefs, to trade their principles for social approval. Faith, tradition, and personal conviction are mocked as outdated, relics of a time long gone. But Clint Eastwood showed that authenticity, integrity, and respect for one's values are not weaknesses. They are the foundations of real strength. This story isn't just about an interview gone wrong. It's about something much bigger. It's about standing tall in a world that wants to tear you down. It's about refusing to apologize for who you are. It's about having the courage to believe in something, even when the world tells you not to. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that we need more Clint Eastwoods in the world. People who aren't afraid to speak their truth, who don't cave under pressure, who don't let their values be dictated by the shifting tides of popular opinion. So if you believe in that message, if you believe that truth, conviction, and respect still matter, then don't let this story end here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with your friends. Because the more we stand together, the stronger we become. And in a world that's constantly trying to silence those who speak the truth, the best thing we can do is make sure their voices are heard loud and clear.